Hello and welcome to the City of London Corporation's Apprenticeship webinars. I'm Claire Tunley, the Head of Employability at the City of London Corporation. Since the apprenticeship levy was introduced back in 2017, we've supported a lot of businesses in understanding how apprenticeships work, how to make the apprenticeships work for their business. Sometimes the processes can seem a bit complex, particularly if you're a small or medium-sized business who doesn't necessarily have a big HR capacity to engage with the process, but you might be paying the levy and you want to use your investment. So, to help businesses like yours understand the process, we've designed this series of 8 videos to look at some of the complex issues and simplify some of the steps involved to take on an apprentice. We're going to cover a range of apprenticeship topics in the videos, including what the levy is, how to use it, how to involve stakeholders in your business, looking at how to engage training providers and what an endpoint assessor is, and how you might want to recruit an apprentice. While all the information covered is accurate and up to date as of today, please do refer to the Government Apprenticeship website for the most up-to-date information, and all the information we're going to cover will be available online from the government's website. Today, we're just having an introduction to apprenticeships, and I'm joined by Peter Pledger. He's CEO of the National Skills Academy for Financial Services, and we're going to look at just what apprenticeships are and set the scene. Hello, Peter.
Hello.
So many people ask us, what actually is an apprenticeship?
An apprenticeship is a job with training. It can be any job that any employer wishes to recruit an individual for. It can be for any individual over the age of 16. It can be for somebody who is new to an organisation, which typically most people see as an apprentice. But it can also be for an existing member of staff where an employer wishes to upskill them for a new role.
Okay, you said it's for anyone over the age of 16. Does that mean it's for young people only, or can it be for any age?
It can be for any age. There is no upper limit to undertake an apprenticeship. And there are many people doing apprenticeships in their 30s, 40s and 50s.
And how long do they last?
Every apprenticeship can last no less than 12 months. Some of them go much longer. It's typical for an apprenticeship to last 18 months to 2 years, but many of them are 3 and 4 years.
So we hear a lot about standards and frameworks and other strange things when we talk about apprenticeships. So can you tell us, Peter, what do these terms mean?
The standard is the level that an individual apprentice needs to get to so that they are fully competent in the job that they are doing the apprenticeship for. It outlines the skills, the knowledge and behaviour that the apprentice needs to acquire. Now, standards are relatively new, and there is a particular standard for particular jobs. There are many hundreds of these at the moment, and that number is increasing. Standards are replacing an older system called frameworks, which was a different way to determine the skills, knowledge and behaviour that an individual needed to acquire when they completed their apprenticeship. My recommendation is that wherever possible, an employer should always try to make sure that the apprentice they take on is studying to complete a standard rather than a framework.
So we've heard that there's hundreds of standards and different skill areas where apprentices can be trained in, but what about different levels, Peter?
Indeed, many employers get confused by the issue of levels, and one of the difficulties is that levels come from the world of education and training, and most employers aren't involved in that world. It actually, the model is relatively simple. Anyone who went to school would know about GCSEs, and a level 2 apprenticeship is equivalent to 5 GCSEs. Most people will know about A-levels, and a level 3 apprenticeship is equivalent to 2 A-levels. The level 4, level 5 and level 6 is equivalent to the first, second and third year of university, and level 7 is at postgraduate level. Now, it's important to note here that most people think that apprenticeships are only for entry-level jobs and basic jobs. And you can see that because you can do apprenticeships at university level and postgraduate level, it stretches people to very high standards indeed.
There isn't necessarily a apprenticeship standard at all 7 levels in every subject area yet, is there? For example, compliance of risk doesn't have a standard at level 7, for example.
Indeed. In many parts of the economy that there is no need for level 7 or level 5 apprenticeship, but in other parts that there are. However, it's not the government that's determining when they're going to be created. Employers themselves have to come together to agree that there's a need, to agree what is required, what skills, what knowledge and behaviour is required, and then to agree on that standard.
And it's important to note as well, I think, that the standard and the level that the apprentice works towards is what they'll achieve at the end of the apprenticeship. So they won't necessarily be at that level when they start. So moving on to the next slide, looking at training now. So apprenticeships, you said, Peter, that they are jobs with training. So tell us a little bit about how this training works. Can I train an apprentice myself?
Well, there's nothing stopping an employer training their own apprentice. The issue, however, is who gets paid to do that training, because the only people who can be paid to do the training for an apprentice is somebody who's on the register of approved apprenticeship training providers. But what I will say is that the apprenticeship training is a shared endeavour. It must involve the approved training provider, which the employer will pick, but it must also involve the employer themselves, because the hope is that the apprentice has all the skills, knowledge and behaviour they require and meets the needs of the employer that they are working for. Now, that training will be delivered sometimes in the workplace and sometimes away from work. There is a requirement that every single apprentice has 20% off the job training. 20% of their paid time with the employer, remember this is a job with training, so therefore they are paid, 20% of that time they must be doing something other than the work that they were employed to do, so that they can acquire the skills, knowledge and behaviour to fully deliver the job that they are being trained to do.
We'll be covering more detail on the training element and the 20% off the job in workshop 4. Am I right in thinking that if you want to deliver training, you have to be on the government register of training providers? Does that mean you have to be inspected?
It does. Anybody can apply to go onto the register of approved training providers. Many employers have done that, although they tend to be the larger employers. Most of the organisations on that register are either colleges or private training providers or voluntary and community training providers. The advantage for them is that they have to meet certain standards set by government, that they can deliver the levy, they can draw down the money that will pay for the training for the levy, but it also means that they will be subject to inspection. And the inspection body for this area of work is Ofsted.
Peter, you mentioned about the training, and the training providers are the people that can actually be paid for the training that apprentices undertake. So does this where the levy comes in, the apprenticeship levy?
Yes, it does. Last year, the government introduced a scheme where any employer with a wage bill of more than £3 million has to pay 0.5% of that into a pot, which is called the apprenticeship levy. It is paid on a monthly basis in the same way that employers pay all their other payments to HMRC. The money then sits in that pot with the name of the employer on it. The employer then has 2 years to draw down that money to use for apprenticeship training. The money can only be used for approved apprenticeship training with an approved apprenticeship training provider, and also for the payment of endpoint assessors, who are separate organisations which the government has given the task of determining whether or not an apprentice has reached the required standard.
So does this mean that you can't use the levy for wages?
Absolutely not. The government has been very, very clear what the money can be used for, and essentially it can be used for the training of the apprentice and for the endpoint assessment of the apprentice. It cannot be used for the wages for the apprentice.
And what about businesses that are smaller and won't be paying the levy? Can they still get some help with the training costs?
Indeed, they can. The government has got a parallel system for those employers that have a wage bill of less than £3 million, where if they take on an apprentice using an apprenticeship training provider from this very same list, or from in fact a wider list that the government has produced, If they do that, the government will pay 90% of the cost of the training, but the expectation is that the employer pays 10% of the cost themselves as a cash payment into the training. So whether it's through the levy, where all the money is drawn from the employer and pays for all the training, or it's a non-levy employer where 90% of the money comes from government, 10% of the money will come from the employer themselves. In either case, there is government support to make this work.
Okay, thank you. And I'm guessing that any further information that businesses want to look at for training providers or about the levy or their digital account for the levy, they can find it on the government website.
Indeed. Well, you mentioned the digital account, Claire, and this is quite important because every single employer should register for a digital account. There's no cost to doing that, but it means that they can get full free access to information to guide them through the process. If they then embark on an apprenticeship program, they can then pick the standards that will meet their needs. They can pick.
Thank you very much, Peter. And that concludes our Introduction to Apprenticeships webinar. We have some more detailed webinars on some of the topics we've covered that you can look at separately. Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you.